And now we're going to have Kelly Krause join us.
Hello, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you to Columbia for having me and giving me the opportunity to speak to you all today. Just going to share my screen here. There we go. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about something that's always popular, which is looking at nature covers and what makes a good cover. There probably will be questions around how do we select covers and that kind of thing, and I'm happy to answer those. But this is going to be looking at what we look for in covers and the sort of things we're thinking about when we are creating or commissioning our covers. There we go. So a cover is ideally, will have three things for a journal cover. One of the things it must do is it must tell a story that represents the research accurately. So it must be built around data and sort of accurate science. At the same time, though, we want to layer in a bit of creativity. It's not a figure in your paper. It is something where we can be a bit more abstract and creative. But we need to make sure that there are no misleading elements. And then thirdly, I think, and perhaps obviously, it should be aesthetically pleasing, shall we say, or attractive. So it's safe to say that I think all covers should be a perfect blend of science and art. So, you know, it's not just the science, it's not like a research figure, and it's not just a piece of art. It needs to communicate something, you know, in a scientific context, it needs to communicate the science, and it needs to be very high quality as well. So. And, you know, I always tell authors and people where we're trying to visualize the research into one image that covers, you can be thought about a bit like movie posters. And so if you think about a movie poster, you know, something that, you know, if you're seeing it for the first time and you haven't seen the film or you haven't seen any trailers, you know, what it is really is it's a teaser, and it's sort of this artistic interpretation of the film in an image that gives, you know, some key elements, but it's not telling the whole story. It's not burdened with telling the whole story. You can kind of pick and choose the elements that you want to feature. And so I have a few a few classic movie posters with a few of our covers here. Sorry, my Irish setter is getting a little aggressive. So, you know, we liken our covers to have a bit of drama and a bit of action, if relevant. Or our covers can sometimes be iconic, you know, so if we have sort of big projects or things that we want to sort of build a more iconic approach around. Also, you know, we could use sort of graphic devices such as typography rather than a sort of strict sort of object-based approach to create a beautiful cover. And in this part, I'm going to go into the kind of a lot of along the lines of sort of the things that Michael was just talking about in terms of black holes. It's sort of how do you go from sort of raw data into visualizing a concept that is aesthetically pleasing, and this sort of goes into the concept of, so you have objects, and then a lot of times you have sort of metaphors. So I'm going to kind of walk through that. And it is true that some things are much easier to visualize than others, and how generally speaking it goes is as if your research is sort of based around an object. Like in this example here, we have the HIV virus, things like, you know, cells, planets, like things. Those things tend to be easier to draw and easier to conceptualize, regardless of the medium. When you're dealing with things that are more sort of phenomena or process, such as like quantumness, for example, which I'm going to show here, you know, like that actually requires a bit more creativity. And what we tend to do is we tend to rely on metaphors. And in order for a metaphor to work, it has to be shared widely enough for people to understand what you're doing. So this paper here for this cover was about quantum cryptography. And you're sort of like, well, you know, what does quantumness look like? Does it look like a bunch of sort of waves or colors, bursts of light? You know, and what does cryptography look like? And so obviously, you know, we sort of went with, well, the lock metaphor here, but in a kind of abstract way with the faces are supposed to be Alice and Bob. You know, so building in things that are sort of metaphorical to tell the story. It's, you know, but it requires, you know, this kind of thing is not as easily done, but it can be. This is another example of the use of metaphor. So this was a special issue on microfluidics and specifically looking at sort of their very sort of practical. And so we were, you know, sort of kicking around what are some metaphors for practical. And the Swiss Army knife was sort of maybe an obvious concept, but one of our in-house illustrators, you know, the red bit there is a microfluidic device, and then sort of tacked on the classic Swiss Army accoutrement and whatever, and you know, so, and it made a nice cover. So so that's another example of a metaphor. Also, you know, like this, the drama of GMO and sort of taking some drama symbols, the Janus masks, which are often used as a metaphor for drama, making it as some nice bread. But again, you get the idea here of metaphors. This is an example. So this was a cover submission. This was not a nature cover. This is a submission. So oftentimes people, when they submit nature covers, they'll put the nature stuff around it. So, but this was a submission, and it's a question mark. And I think I just wanted to highlight this because these kinds of things come in often, that there are some metaphors that are overused. And one of them is a question mark, because I think all science can probably be reduced to a question mark in some form, all research, I should say. So, so, you know, to just think about maybe, you know, things that we tend to avoid, that we get a lot, are question marks, puzzle pieces, how things like, you know, breaking something into a puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle. Chess, or like we get scissors a lot in biology, you know, for sort of editing, like genome editing and that kind of thing. So we try very hard to come up with a sort of more interesting ways of showing these things. This bit is, you know, so once you've come up with a good concept and a good metaphor, you know, the other piece is to execute it beautifully. So these are tips here for that. So in order for something to be on a cover, it's, you know, covers are digital things, but they are still at the moment printed. And so in order for a cover to print beautifully, it has to have certain kind of technical quality. So that, you know, you could have the most beautiful, interesting image in the world, but if it doesn't have good technical quality, we more than likely would not be able to use it. And then the second thing is, you know, a sort of more vague and much discussed idea of aesthetics, aesthetic value or beauty. And I think in this context, aesthetic, what I mean by that is just a sort of attractiveness, which is subjective, but I think can more or less be shared. So kind of further breaking that down, what do we mean by attractiveness or quality? So this brings in, like, you know, classic principles of art and design, like composition. So composition meaning the sort of arrangements of elements and space within an image. Then there is also, sorry, let me just dismiss this. There's also things about like just the basic qualities such as clarity, resolution, and then there's a bit about color, which I'll talk about. There we go. So this is something in terms of composition that some people probably have heard of, called the rule of thirds. And so, you know, when you're out, let's say, photographing something, it is a very typical, almost instinctual thing to put the subject in the center of your frame. But actually, images tend to be a bit more dynamic and interesting to people, to observers, when things are not centered. So, so there is this sort of handy rule of thirds thing, where it's a very simple grid that you can draw over a composition and try to get away from centering things. And this is just a quick example of how most of our covers probably are use this. We will sometimes center things, but not very often. There's also, which you probably have heard about, the golden ratio and the idea of the golden ratio. I'm not going to go into that because it's a bit controversial. Actually, some people say that the golden ratio can be applied to anything. So yeah, so anyway, just haha, but I'm not going to go into that too much. Something important is the idea of simplicity, particularly when we're talking about an image that's going to be used for a cover. What some people, so this was a cover submission, and and on its own, it's kind of interesting. But if you think about a cover, there a lot of stuff goes on a cover. You have to have a sort of cover line, and the logo goes up top, and all kinds of other things that we call page furniture in the business. And so it's I always recommend, because speaking only on behalf of Nature and the Nature journals, but you can submit as many cover submissions as you want. And I always say, it strip something back as far as you can, even to it almost kind of seems bare to you, and that actually probably is the thing that will make the best cover image. So what we did was we worked with the group, the research group on this one, and we asked them to kind of zoom in on a space, and then we dropped part of it back and sort of made it grayscale, and sort of added a bit more detail to other bits, and to make it a bit more suitable for a cover, a little less complicated and a little more simple. Another point about clarity. So much of this actually starts in the lab or in your experimental setup or in the field. So you will need some high resolution, high quality raw materials to begin with. So when you use photography or video or microscopy or however you're capturing your images, give a lot of thought of it in the beginning, to it in the beginning, because then you will have some high quality material to make your covers or websites or press releases or that sort of thing. And so in this example, on the left, this is kind of a photo illustration actually, but the bit with the graphene, that kind of sort of block with the graphene on it, is a photo from the lab. And then they actually did photograph the sort of blue bits. There's a microfluidic layers. But then we ended up computer rendering those, but we had like an actual thing to work from. And so that was, really useful, and made a nice cover. And then on the right, it's just sort of classic microscopy, but it's very high resolution, which gave us a lot to work with, and we were able to put that in print. A bit about color and color blindness. So, red and green tends to be default for some imagery in some fields, but because of red-green color blindness, we do not feature red and green combinations on the cover. So we just did a simple hue shift in Photoshop, and a little tilting of it to give it a more interesting composition in the final, which is the submissions on the left and the final versions on the right. But that's just something to think about, color blindness. And if you don't, the Photoshop, if you use it, has some built-in tools that can help you determine whether or not your images are colorblind friendly or not. But also a very old kind of tried and tested thing is to just make something grayscale. And if you can't see the differences, then often that, if you don't have this sort of technology, if you just have like a black and white printer or something, that actually gives you a lot of information about how a colorblind person might see something. And then I get a lot of questions about, what is the best kind of artistic media? What do you like? Do you like, they notice, and this is true, that on Nature, a lot of our covers are computer art, basically computer aided art. So be it from a 3D render or, some other kind of computer assisted art. And I think because Nature itself is a weekly, that sort of art is really easy to kind of modify quickly. And so that tends to be sort of for practical reasons, but there is no best artistic media, and we accept all kinds, from classic painting and drawing to, to the more sort of, I won't say sophisticated, but different kinds of 3D rendering. And then there's also, as I'll go through, yeah, so here was a recent cover that was based on a cryo-EM, so a sophisticated microscopy, but is actually a watercolor work, which is really lovely. This is a photo illustration done in Photoshop, so no modeling really needed. It was just a beautiful illustration slash photo mashup. this sort of 3D rendering again is something that we use it quite a lot, because it does tend to suit sort of, the ability to, much of science is sort of investigating things that you can't see with a naked eye, right? So so computer 3D rendering, be it something in space or something, at the level of microscopy, this sort of 3D realistic rendering kind of it sort of gives us the feeling of going in places that we can't ourselves actually go. Um, and then sometimes when we're really lucky, we get groups that have built sort of bespoke modeling software, and they're showing interesting things in really original ways for the first time. And that is a real wonderful thing about working at Nature. It's a real privilege to be working with some of the world's best scientists on their amazing visuals. I'm going to end this bit by just saying that Nature is still, we still print it, and it's still a printed thing, but a lot of it is also consumed digitally. And we think about that when sort of commissioning our covers and working with artists. And so this is an example of, this is actually a still from a high resolution animation that we commissioned as part of a package that was the cover and an animation. We did the same thing for our recent 150 anniversary cover. This is actually a still from an animation rather than the other way around, building a print cover and then thinking, how do we animate it? So that's much more of our thinking these days. And it was also interactive. And then very quickly, my last few slides are just giving you a little bonus, little look into some of the common reasons for rejections. We try to keep it clean at Nature, so please send us images without any kind of, romance, please. This happens a lot. We get a lot of kind of innocent, but it is still like copyright infringement. So people will reference like Star Wars or Ghostbusters or this or that, and but we can't use those things. And last slide, this is just kind of random, but really one of my favorite rejections, just because it's sort of a mouse on a massage table with all kinds of detail and stuff. It was like, obviously not great for the cover, but fun, and did get our attention. And we did actually feature their paper on the cover, but we used a nice photograph instead. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. That was really fascinating.